when you're the only one working to clarify expectations, rebuild communication, extend grace, then trust no longer exists if you're the only one doing it. And at that point, you're not rebuilding trust. What you are doing is you're managing disappointment. You're listening to Leading Well, the podcast for executive women and the men who support them, who are ready to lead with clarity, confidence, and compassion. I'm your host, Gretchen Schott. Let's dive in. Hey friends, thanks for coming back. Today I want to talk about when disappointment becomes a loss of trust. And it's been a couple weeks since I recorded, and it was funny as I was thinking about getting behind the mic today. I know the last episode I had talked about disappointment and leadership, and then I said my next episode is going to be about disappointment and how that leads to a lack of trust, and then I didn't record a couple episodes. So you probably, if you're following this show, you might have been disappointed that I haven't fulfilled that promise. But today's that day. So I just asked for a little grace. I had to travel for work. I went out of the country, and then I was involved with a very big fundraiser. And quite honestly, like show choir guys is like taking up too much of my life right now, honestly. So I apologize for those loyal listeners of the show that have not heard from me in a bit. But this is the episode where we're going to talk and dive into how disappointment becomes a loss of trust and how that can affect our leadership. And I shared before, I've done some research on this because I was really struggling with this topic myself. I was very disappointed with some things that were going on in and around my life. So I did some research on this. So I've got some notes that I'm going to be reading from today. Funny enough, I had an old friend from college listen to the show, and he reached out to me and he shared with me, he's like, I noticed that you're like looking at your notes and you should get a teleprompter. And appreciate the feedback. But I'm also like very real, and I'm not trying to be like over polished. I just want to be honest with my thoughts and reaching out to all you guys. So if you're watching this and you see me looking down and you see me reading my notes, it's because I care very much about what I say, but also more importantly, about acknowledging the work of others that I lift up and highlight. So let's get into this. So I want to take the conversation back about disappointment. And the last time I talked about disappointment, what it is, how it shows up in leadership, and how kind of like we process it. But today, what I want to do is I want to take that to another level, and I want to explain what happens when disappointment kind of shapes and changes how we trust, and how we trust at work, and how we trust within our leadership, and what that looks like. Because sometimes disappointment isn't about the outcome, but rather it's about something deeper that's been lost. And when trust erodes, leaders face some of the most difficult discernment questions. In my coaching practice, I have coached many a leader who has been wrestling and struggling with this question of, how long do I stay? How do I keep rebuilding trust? Or asking that big question of, when is it time to move on? I've had the joy of working with many leaders through their career arcs and in their journey. And if you've worked anywhere for any amount of time, the question of trust absolutely comes up. And so this is not an easy question to answer. And I want to talk about what trust really is. I want to talk about how it erodes and how leaders can begin to discern what is actually being repaired or when it might be time to make a change. I have talked about Brené Brown before. I want to talk about her work again here. And specifically, she has this framework that she teaches called braving, which describes elements of the things that make trust possible, like the elements that need to be present to make trust possible. And she uses the acronym braving, which stands for boundaries, reliability, accountability, integrity, confidentiality, non-judgment, and generosity towards one another. And what I love about her work is that she reminds us that trust is not built through one big, huge, grand gesture, not one big, huge thing that we do, but rather these small, intentional, repeated moments over time. And often when I'm talking about trust and I'm teaching about trust, I often say that trust is also reciprocal. So you can't give what you don't receive, and you can't receive that which you aren't willing to give. So when someone consistently does what they say that they will do, and when they take responsibility for their mistakes, and when they treat people with integrity and respect, trust grows, right? It rarely collapses all at once. It's rarely one thing that happens and suddenly all the trust is wiped out. Trust erodes over time with small disappointments, small cuts that we just learn to start tolerating until we can't anymore. And so in a leadership environment, trust erodes in a couple kind of like predictable ways, right? So the first one is repeated unmet expectations. When we are working for someone and we continue to see that they are not meeting our expectations, or the employer is continually not meeting our expectations, that's not a one-time thing. That's not a twice-time thing. That's a multiple-time type of thing. And that pattern then becomes really clear to us. Another way that trust erodes is when apologies replace accountability. I'm all about accountability. Accountability is intention with action, right? And apologies are just simply that, just apology. They are words. Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, I love his work too, and he's done some really great stuff with this. I talked about his work with regards to discretionary effort the last time we were talking, but in this regard, he talks about that the difference between intentions and behavior are that words matter, but that trust is rebuilt through changed action. He also says that apologies can open the door to repair, but they cannot replace it. Right? So that's important. I think a lot of times when we're holding on to perhaps a disappointment, or we're holding on to something where we feel like trust has been broken, we might be thinking like what we just need to hear is an apology. But that sometimes isn't enough, right? It's the apology with the action, because the apology with the accountability is where we start to fill back up, where we start to receive and desire to rebuild that connection and that trust. Trust also erodes when one person carries the emotional burden of that repair, when one person carries it. So when you're the only one working to clarify expectations, rebuild communication, extend grace, then trust no longer exists if you're the only one doing it. And at that point, you're not rebuilding trust. What you are doing is you're managing disappointment. So let's talk about that. So how many times do you need to continue to rebuild trust? A lot of leaders really struggle with this, right? They ask, like, how many chances should I give? Like, how many times does this person have to disappoint me? How many times do I have to keep tolerating this behavior? But the better question is not how many times. The better question is trust actually being repaired? So let's sit there for a second. Here are a couple discernment questions that you can ask yourself in this situation. Like, is trust actually being repaired, right? So has responsibility been taken without defensiveness? That's one way. If a person is taking responsibility without being defensive, that's showing you that they are demonstrating a desire to repair this relationship. They are desiring connection with you when they are taking responsibility without defensiveness. If they're being defensive, then they're still holding on to some things and they need to work through some stuff on their own. The second question we have to ask ourselves is trust actually being repaired because has behavior actually changed? Have they actually changed their behavior? Now, we can't judge that behavior, the depth of that behavior, but has behavior actually changed? Because if behavior has actually changed, and that is working towards it, we can get re-disappointed with, well, they haven't changed enough. They didn't change in the way that I thought they would. That's another level of disappointment. But as we're thinking about this from trust, like, can this relationship be repaired from a trusting standpoint? Are they actually changing their behavior? And is it becoming safer over time to trust this person, or is it becoming smaller? What I mean by that is that behavior change small, like just to appease you, and then they go back and they redo what you have asked them not to? Or is it's a small change and you can recognize they're wrestling with it and they're trying? That is a reason to extend grace. That is a reason to invest more time in rebuilding that trust. But if the pattern is not moving towards repair, then endurance can really start to feel like betrayal. And in this case, we can feel like we're betraying ourselves because we start to feel foolish. We start to question ourselves, like, am I foolish for continuing to give this person another chance? Am I foolish for continuing to believe what this person says they're going to do, right? So we need to pay attention to the patterns that we're seeing in this relationship, in this conversation with this person, in the actions of the organization, wherever that trust might be broken. And so oftentimes when I'm working with people too, we talk about trust, and there's a lot of people that want to compare trusting relationships at work like they do with trusting relationships in marriage, or comparing work and marriage life and all of those things. And they are different. Marriage researcher John Gottman has literally spent decades talking about what makes a marriage thrive. And one of his key findings is that healthy marriages are not defined by the absence of conflict, okay? They are defined by the ability to repair quickly and repeatedly. So the perfect marriages aren't ones where they never fight. The perfect marriages are not the ones where people have no problems. Like every marriage has problems. Every marriage has conflict. But the difference is that good marriage engages in productive conflict. They recognize it, they repair it, and they move on quickly and repeatedly, over and over, because it's a covenant. In strong marriages, partners acknowledge hurt, they take accountability, and they actively work to restore connection. Marriage is built on a covenant, right? So it assumes both people keep working towards this relationship over time. Workplaces operate differently. Workplaces are not covenantal. They are contractual. And so an organization that is not built around a lifelong commitment, there are different power dynamics. This is kind of where a lot of like high integrity leaders, I feel like, get really, really stuck. They apply marriage values to professional systems. They offer loyalty to their employer without expecting or receiving repair for broken trust. They provide grace in many instances without boundaries around that. They give hope without any evidence that it's warranted. They sometimes stay far longer in a workplace than it's healthy to do so. Because at work, staying can sometimes mean we're absorbing lots of damages. And that's not what healthy leadership looks like. So if you find yourself in a season where trust has been damaged, I would invite you to reflect on these types of questions. And these statements. First, let me say that staying is not always strength. Leaving is not always weakness. But wisdom is knowing which season that you're in. So I want you to ask yourself honestly, if you're in this season of feeling disappointed, recognizing that disappointment has eroded trust, either in your job, in your relationship with your boss, in your relationships with other people, within your workmates, whatever that relationship might be. Ask yourself honestly, is trust being repaired? And if it's not, am I simply learning to live without it? And if you're living without it, I'd ask you why. All of us deserve to be in a relationship that is built on trust. All of us deserve the right to be trusted and to give trust back. We can only give what we receive. Sometimes we have to ask ourselves, how do I know I am trustworthy? And how do I know I'm being trusted? It's very different. How do I know I'm being trusted? And how do I know I'm being trustworthy? Because if we know that about ourselves, then we will put that out into our relationships. But if we can't answer those two questions about ourselves, why in the world would we expect anyone to trust us? If we can't define what it looks like for us to be trustworthy, how do we expect anyone else to understand that we're trustworthy? If we can't define what it looks like for us to be trusted, how do we expect anyone else to trust us? And so Scripture reminds us that we're not meant to navigate difficult decisions alone. And I love, one of my favorite books in the Bible is James. And in the letter of James, specifically James chapter 1, verse 5, he says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And so I ask you, how are you understanding yourself? And how generous are you being with yourself to deserve trust, to be trusted, to expect trust? And so I want to close with a prayer because I like to leave you with his words, not mine. But I wrote this prayer for you if you're wrestling with this topic and you're in this season. So here we go. Lord, give us the wisdom to see clearly. When disappointment clouds our hearts and trust feels fragile, give us and guide us in truth. Help us remain people of integrity and courage. Teach us when to persevere with patience and when to step forward in freedom. Guard our hearts from bitterness. Keep us rooted in hope. May we lead with clarity, love, and faith in your guidance. Amen. So these last 2 episodes have been a little heavier. It's not easy talking about being disappointed. It's not easy talking about relationships perhaps needing a change or eroding trust. But if you're in this kind of season, I would love to help you with that. I'd love to work with you. So if you are needing a little guidance, you need a little help, maybe getting unstuck, please reach out to me. Let's talk. Set up a free consultation with me and we can talk through what a coaching engagement might look like to kind of get you kind of unstuck and move from a place of being disappointed to feeling connection and moving away from a place of bitterness into a place of hope. Until next time, I hope you continue to lead well. Ready to lead well or need some coaching and encouragement? Sign up for my newsletter or reach out for a personal consultation. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a review.